In this lecture, I want to look at the Greek world and the expansion under Alexander and the effects that the Alexandrian expansion had on the biblical world. And the reason for this lecture, in many ways, is because when we look at the early church, we often refer to the Greco-Roman perspective on things, whether it's philosophy or paganism or the empire, and we talk about how the church is influenced by the Greco-Roman world. But unfortunately, for many of us, that means that all we end up talking about is the Roman half of that equation. But in fact, as we'll see in this lecture, much of what the Romans did during their empire had precursors and in many ways overlapping sympathies with the way that Alexander and the Greek world expanded out east. And so we're going to look at Alexander and the expansion of the Macedonian and Greek empires to the east and its takeover of Persia. And we're going to then take a look at how that expansion and how the Greek cultural ethos began to shape the backdrop to the New Testament biblical world. We'll show how the Jews adapted to Hellenization and how they resisted it. Alexander wasn't the first to think up the idea of conquering and expanding the Greek world beyond its own borders. In fact, Alexander's father, Philip II of Macedonia, was really the first to envision this idea. Philip, and as a result Alexander, were technically not originally of Greek descent. They come from an area just north of Greece called Macedonia. Now, the long relationship between Macedonia and Greece, in particular Athens, is a bit torturous, and it is quite complex. From the Macedonian standpoint, of course, they do really see themselves as part of the wider Greek world. They don't see themselves as somehow isolated or detached from the Greek ethos or the Greek culture as a whole, even though they themselves were not Greek by birth. From the Greek side, though, there was often some hesitation, sometimes some outright denial that the Macedonians were, in fact, of Greek descent. You could see this in a number of areas. One of the big differences between Macedonia and Greece and the Greek city-states is the politics that are involved. Most of the Greek city-states were either democracies or they were oligarchies. They had some level of accountability for the leaders that were in charge. Macedonia, though, was pretty much a standard kingdom. And the relationship then between the two was complicated by the fact that they did not really come from the same ethos or from the same context, though, as scholars have pointed out repeatedly, they worshipped many of the same gods. They had many of the same philosophical and liturgical and ritual outlooks on life. And they did see themselves at least as overlapping cultures. And so, despite the fact that at times there is some xenophobic concern from the Athenians or from the Greeks that the Macedonians were usurpers, nonetheless, this is sort of an overlapping world. And when Philip II came to the throne, he really wasn't the one who had been born to it. Philip's brother had been heir to the throne, and with his early death, Philip's brother had a son and an heir. And for a brief period of time, Philip served as the semi-official steward of the realm. But like often happens in hereditary monarchies, both then and all the way throughout the history of monarchies, Philip decides that it's far easier simply to kill the nephew and take the throne for himself. And so at long last, Philip takes the throne. And so Philip decides that having usurped the throne, he is not going to take a policy of simply introspective infrastructure building within Macedonia, but rather that he is going to become expansionistic. That's exactly what he does. He first turns to the northern tribes and regions, he conquers them. He then turns back on Athens and sets his eyes on conquering the majority of the Greek world. And Athens at this time is overseen by Demosthenes. And the tensions and the battles between Greeks and Macedonians comes to a head in 338 when Philip takes the field with his armies and defeats the Athenians. And fatefully, off on the right flank, there is Philip's son Alexander, just 16 years old and taking one of the privileged positions of generalship during the battle. And the battle is won decisively for Philip, and it brings to a closure the Macedonian-Greek struggles. But it also introduced into the Macedonian kingdom a bit of a problem because, of course, all of the regions to the south of Macedonia that Philip had now conquered were not kingdoms. They were city-states in many cases that were often either democracies or they were oligarchies. They were not used to having kingdoms, and they were certainly not used to having kings. In fact, they had a general allergy or an antipathy towards kingship. And in one of his shrewdest moves, Philip decides that he is not going to style himself as king of Greece, but that he is going to still remain king of Macedonia, but that he would be the de facto head of what he now called the Hellenistic League. Now, this is really just sort of a compromise of language. By all accounts, Philip is king of both Greece and Macedonia. No one in Greece is going to withstand his opinion. Still, the decision to not style himself king of Greece means, at least in principle, Philip is immune to the idea that he has somehow conquered and changed the Greek ethos into something that is Macedonian. If that's a moment of wisdom for Philip, there was immediately a moment of foolishness. Philip inevitably wrecks his own kingship. The first thing he does is he decides to take a Macedonian wife. Now, Alexander's mother, one of Philip's previous wives, was Olympia. And Olympia was not Macedonian. She was from another region entirely. She was devoted to the cult of Dionysus, and one of the things that the cult of Dionysus brought with it was an element of snake worship. At least snakes featured heavily in the cult of Dionysus. And there are all kinds of stories of Olympia letting large snakes sort of slither around the bedroom. And in one case, there are scandalous reports of her attempting to have sexual relations with them. And there are all kinds of quite disgusting pagan practices that go along with the cult of Dionysus that Alexander's mother was known to have participated in. But from the vantage of the Macedonians, she was not a Macedonian. She was an outsider. And so for Philip to take a different wife, and this one being fully Macedonian, meant that there was now some opportunity for Philip to have a fully Macedonian heir. And in fact, what happened after the betrothal is, in typical Macedonian fashion, they gathered together and they got roaring drunk. And as the story goes, Attalus, one of Philip's men, decided that he was going to raise a toast. And when he raises the toast, he toasts that finally, he says, Philip will have an heir that is truly Macedonian. Now, this is pretty dumb, even if you're drunk and have lost the ability to hold your tongue. Knowing that Alexander is sitting there to say that finally you'll be able to have an heir is not the wisest thing. And in fact, Alexander stands up and says, "What does that make me, you villain?" And of course, the situation is quite dire because Philip stands up at this point, draws his sword, and attempts to duel it out with his son, Alexander. And at least according to one of the accounts, if Philip had not been roaring drunk himself and fallen all over himself and landed sort of face down and seemingly unable to move in his stupor, that they would engage in some sort of Luke Skywalker, Darth Vader battle. So that's one misstep. The second misstep for Philip is that he, at one point, had a male lover and he had scorned him, but not removed him from the central court. And that actually led to Philip being assassinated. 2 years after, during one of the assemblies, famously as the statues of the 12 gods of Greece were paraded in, as Philip had the audacity to add a statue of himself as the 13th in line. And as they are processing, at one point, the scorned lover sneaks up on Philip and sticks a knife in his ribs. Now, commentators, both then and all the way down until today, have not managed to absolve Alexander fully of the assassination of his father, particularly given the fact that 2 years earlier there had been this threat to lose his hereditary place in line. Nevertheless, Alexander comes to the throne with the assassination of Philip, and like his father, he has his eyes set on expansion. Now, Philip had talked with the Hellenistic League about his desire to attack Persia. And of course, there's nothing that unites the Greeks more than the idea of attacking their old enemy, their old nemesis, Persia. And the Hellenistic League was generally in favor of this. And Alexander inherits this. What Alexander brings, though, as he comes to the throne of Macedonia and to the head of the Hellenistic League, is he comes with a bit more of an awareness of the martial requirement to take on Persia. And the thing that Alexander lands on as being the pivotal need for his armies would be that of cavalry. Now, in this day and age, most warfare, particularly by the Greeks and the Macedonians, would be conducted on foot. It would be a hoplite, which would be something like a skirmisher, hand-to-hand combat, javelins, these kinds of things. Or they would use a phalanx. And a phalanx, of course, we've all seen in accounts of Sparta and the 300. The phalanx is the wedge design shape where you have these quite large shields and you would form together as one unit. And another unit would often sort of have the same formation or similar formation, and you would slam into each other. And rather than as often depicted in movies, a lot of the warfare, at least at the initial surge, would not be a lot of stabbing and not trying to poke your enemy in the eye, but rather it looked something like an offensive and defensive line trying to push each other back, something like an inverted tug of war. The two wedges would smash into each other, and you would sort of push, and the unit that was strongest and that would push the other back often would break the rank, if not causing some of them to stumble and trip. And then, of course, if you won, you would have your way with those who were left straggling. But Alexander chose cavalry. He realized that there was an advantage of height, being upon a horse. There was an advantage of energy, not having to walk everywhere. There was an advantage of speed and tactical maneuvering that could be enacted by cavalry that could not be enacted on foot. And so he goes off to the east to conquer. And in fact, he almost immediately comes up against a major Persian army, led, we are told, by Darius III himself, the Persian ruler, and Alexander has a decisive victory. And so here we have Alexander, just 21 years of age, having now conquered a major knot of the Persian army. Now, Persia has not been fully defeated, and Alexander will go on to defeat them. Darius is later assassinated, and then the usurper is easily and handily defeated by Alexander's armies a few years later. But for all intents and purposes at this point, Alexander is now lord of Asia. This introduces another change for Greek rulers in how they deal with their subjects. Because if the Macedonians had a kingship, and the Greek city-states had oligarchies and democracies, in Persia and in other areas of Asia, in the Near East, what you have is actually a deification in many cases of the emperor. And historians have looked at this quite a long time, and they've noticed that actually Alexander starts to look more increasingly Persian in his stylings of his own authority. He starts to wear Persian and Asian clothing, for example. He starts to talk about the cult of his own divinity. There is a famous story that when conquering the regions around Egypt, Alexander went to the oracle of Zeus at Siwa, and while he was there, the oracle comes out and greets Alexander as the son of Zeus. In the Greek world, at best, you should deny this. Perhaps you should be righteously indignant that the name of Zeus should be given to a mere mortal, but in Alexander's case, we are told he seems to accept it. And in fact, a lot of what Alexander starts to become and the stylizing of his own rule becomes that of the East, the Persian world in particular, where the kings are deified, they are sort of on par with God, the godlike power is imbued in them. And this Persian godlike sense of one's own authority is one of the rare cross-fertilizations that comes from the Asian world back into Greece and then eventually, at least indirectly, into the Roman world when you have the Roman Empire. The ability of certain emperors over the centuries to refer to themselves as gods or deities or as being imbued with godlike powers does not wane, it only increases. Now, Alexander continues to expand, and as the armies sort of march further east, they end up coming right to the point where they're about to cross into India, and is at this point that Alexander has a bit of a mutiny on his hands. At least his armies refuse to press on further into the Indian subcontinent. And so Alexander draws back, and he continues to try to consolidate, but as all the histories are unanimous in pointing out, Alexander is best at conquering, he's not best at leading. And at the end, Alexander dies. And at his death, Alexander's empire does not last. It's just like his father. The victories were sweet when they occurred, but they did not last. And in fact, at the end of time, the empire is divided up. And the Alexandrian Empire, the Macedonian Empire, gets divided up almost equally in some cases amongst the generals of Alexander's army. The men who had led the armies on all of these campaigns were finally rewarded with the spoils of war by being able to carve up the empire into the regions that they desired. And some of these names are familiar to us. The Ptolemies take over Egypt. The Seleucid Empire takes over parts of Syria and Iran, and eventually Jerusalem itself becomes an overlapping Ptolemaic Seleucid province. And the last thing we need to really note about the Alexandrian War is with the dividing up of Alexander's empire, what you have is the establishment of a very curiously Greek and Macedonian way of managing and ruling an empire. When you look at the Greeks and the way that they ruled, often when they would talk about Greek culture expanding around the world, for them it wasn't so much the idea that they would intermingle with other cultures and borrow those cultures in the extreme sense, but the Greek culture rather would expand out into the other parts of the world. Now, one of the main foundations of Greek culture was its commitment to philosophy, to learning, to education, to poetry, and the arts. And in many cases, the worlds that they conquered were not going to necessarily take on, to great extent, many of these cultures. And so at the end of the day, you have, for a significant period of time, all the way down really until the Roman period, what you have in these regions out east are Macedonian or Greek rulers ruling over a populace of people that are not Greek, that are not offered Greek citizenship, but are nevertheless encouraged to take on Greek qualities or Greek sympathies within their own system. Now, this is going to contrast, as we'll see in a later lecture, with the Roman way of holding out not so much education or culture, but holding out citizenship as the olive branch for other nations becoming integrated into the Roman Empire. That is far more successful of a policy, because you can be an uncultured barbarian, at least in some respects, and still be Roman. You have to meet certain criteria, you have to meet a certain economic status, you have to be a freedman and these kinds of things. So for the Romans, citizenship really becomes the central foundation of its expansion efforts. For the Greeks and for the Macedonians, it was the Greek culture. It was the Greek language. And it was a significant barrier in many ways to the areas that they governed to really ever becoming fully incorporated into a self-identity of the Greek world. And this bears out over each of the subregions that is divided up, the Ptolemies, the Seleucid regions, etc. Now, if that is the context of the Alexandrian or the Macedonian expansion of authority, we can now take a step back and ask the question, now what does this do to the biblical world? And this is really why we have gone through all this material so far in this lecture. Now, of course, this is BC, this is before Christ. There was no real opportunity for Greek Hellenization to affect Christianity, at least not directly. It does begin to shape and affect and change the Jewish world of the Second Temple era. Now, of course, you'll know that the Second Temple era runs from roughly the 6th century BC all the way down until the time of Christ and beyond, when it is finally overthrown in AD 70 by the Roman Empire when Jerusalem falls. But there were Jewish people and Jewish synagogues throughout many of the regions that were being conquered by Alexander and the Hellenistic League. And one of the first things that we see amongst the Jewish faith is some willingness to accommodate and adapt itself to the Hellenistic world. And we know this today as Jewish Hellenization. And there are many examples of how this affects the Jewish culture in a positive sense. So, for example, those of you who have ever had to study biblical Greek will often sometimes ask the question, why is the New Testament written in Koine Greek? Why is it not written in Hebrew or maybe Aramaic? And the short answer is that in much of the world following the Alexandrian conquest, the Greek language becomes, in many ways, the language of choice when you're dealing with multiple regions. Rather than you learning their language, you just require all of your subjects to at least learn a second language of Greek. And so in many areas, Jews at least learn Greek. And this comes to a head eventually in the 3rd century with the translation of the Hebrew Old Testament into Greek. And this is known as the Septuagint. And the Septuagint was translated, according to legend, under Ptolemy, one of the generals who takes over one of the regions of Alexander's empire. And of course, the translation of the Septuagint is one of the great sort of legends of history. The story goes that Ptolemy asked for 70 scholars and rabbis to come to him and he commissions them to each go separately to translate the Old Testament from Hebrew into Greek. And again, according to legend, they each come out, and lo and behold, they each have come up with the exact same translation, sort of a reverse Tower of Babel story, you might say, where you have many people who are inspired in their translation. And of course, the Septuagint has a remarkable effect on the Jewish world. In some cases, the Hebrew language starts to wane. There's some evidence in certain places the Septuagint was preferred to the Hebrew Scriptures, at least in terms of accessibility for those who spoke Greek day in and day out, and therefore wanted the Scriptures in a language that they understood. And the study of the Septuagint today is a vital part of biblical studies. There are all kinds of scholars who use the Septuagint as one of the tools for trying to understand what the Hebrew backdrop or the Hebrew translation of a passage means. Not just reading the text in the Hebrew, but looking at what these 3rd century BC Jews translated the Hebrew into Greek. You can, in part, begin to triangulate between modern English, or at least modern English understanding, and the two ancient languages. We do see the Septuagint being quoted as early as the 2nd century BC. It really has an enormous impact on the Jewish community. But as with anything in a culture, when another culture encroaches on your native culture, particularly amongst the Jews, who saw themselves not only ethnically as Jewish, but biblically as God's people, what happens inevitably, of course, is that those who do not wish to Hellenize, in many ways, push in the opposite direction. What happens is after Hellenization comes to the Jewish world, you have some who begin to push back against this, and they reassert a sort of strongly Jewish, Hebraic ethos of God's covenant people. So there were Jews in these areas who resisted and rejected the Hellenization of the Jewish world. And this resistance comes to a head in the Maccabean revolt. And the Maccabean revolt is from 168 to 167. And what happens is Antiochus IV, one of the leader rulers of the Seleucid Empire, who has governorship over a number of different regions, but one of them is Israel, decides to enact a policy of conformity, of religious conformity, particularly in Jerusalem. And the story as to why this happens is a bit of a mystery. We know that Antiochus's predecessor, Antiochus III, actually is very supportive and very appreciative of the Jewish peoples. In fact, we have documentation of Antiochus III paying for some repairs to the temple and making proclamations that the Jewish people will not be asked to participate in pagan rituals, that the Seleucid Empire will even not bring animals that are unclean into the city or near the temple. And it just shows that what Antiochus IV eventually does to Jerusalem is not so much based out of long-standing anti-Semitic or hostile impulses. There's nothing like what we see in the rest of Western history with anti-Semitism in Antiochus IV's attempt to bring Jerusalem more under the rule of the Seleucid Empire. What we do know, though, is that Antiochus IV was quickly losing his grasp. Antiochus had enacted a bad war against Egypt, a war that eventually came to nothing and that he didn't lose per se, but nevertheless he had to accept a treaty that he did not want. In these days, the Roman Empire was on the rise, and as he's on his way back from his failed attempt to reconquer Egypt, he is greeted by a Roman ambassador named Gaius Popilius Linus. And in the famous story, Linus approaches Antiochus and says to him that the Roman Senate has ruled that he must cease and desist with his actions on Egypt. And Linus famously took out a stick and drew a circle around Antiochus. And he says, and I'm paraphrasing here, "I will have your answer before you cross that line." This is the origin of drawing a line in the sand. And Antiochus is then forced to realize, if he engages in any more hostility with the Egyptians, that he will now have a new powerful enemy in the Roman Senate. And so Antiochus sort of comes back, tail between his legs, licking his wounds, and it seems to be the case that what Antiochus attempts is to galvanize his remaining regions and make them more and more a part of the Seleucid Empire. In other words, no more will Antiochus allow a region like Jerusalem to maintain its own cultural practices, to maintain its own religion. He wants the pagan Greek gods established and sacrificed to in all of his regions. Now, this, of course, is a classic idea of paganism. This is true in the Roman Empire as well, that if there are those in your region who are not sacrificing to the gods will become angered. And despite the fact that there is overwhelming support for these pagan gods around the empire, the one faction who does not do this is to blame for all failures. This is, of course, how Rome treats the Christians. And in this case, it seems to be the case that this is what Antiochus IV does with the Jews, particularly in Jerusalem. And so, almost out of nowhere, suddenly, Antiochus orders that a pig will be sacrificed at the temple, and this is preceded by a number of pagan practices and rituals. But again, the goal here is not based out of the idea of sticking it to the Jews first and foremost, but rather out of an oblivious sense that he can somehow force convert the Jews to become pagans and to sacrifice pigs on the Temple Mount. And the story that we have can then be picked up in the actual 2 books of the Maccabees that occur in the Old Testament Apocrypha. And the story there tells us that Matthias, one of those who had resisted Hellenization, actually steps forward during these events. And when a Hellenistic Jew attempts to make a sacrifice on behalf of the emperor, a thing that Jews were normally exempted from doing, and Jews resisted doing. When a Hellenistic Jew decides to step forward and make a sacrifice, Matthias steps forward and kills him on the spot. Then he and his associates flee up into the hills, and Matthias dies a year later, and he is replaced by Judah Maccabee. Maccabee, of course, is from the Hebrew word hammer, so it's Judah the hammer. And the Maccabees, in essence, take the opportunity of Antiochus's foolish oblivion to the Jewish world as an opportunity to wage an anti-Hellenization war against the Seleucid Empire. Now, they don't have skill in numbers. In fact, in many cases, the Seleucid army could have crushed them in many ways. But what the Maccabees managed to do is engage in what we today call guerrilla warfare. They do skirmishes. They attack when they are least expected. And over time, eventually, Antiochus and the Seleucid army is forced to accept Jewish autonomy, and they withdraw the policies of pagan sacrifice. And as the 2 books of Maccabees tell us, they return to Jerusalem to great fanfare, and the temple is cleansed ritually once and for all so that they can return to the biblical pattern of sacrifices. Those of us today are perhaps aware of the celebration of Hanukkah. Hanukkah comes directly from the Maccabean period. During the ritualistic cleansing of the temple, the Maccabees find only 1 jar of oil that has not been contaminated. It still has a seal on it. And the oil is only enough to light the menorah for 1 day. Of course, it lasts for 8 nights. And that is why Hanukkah, of course, is 8 nights. So to conclude, the Hellenistic world spreads rapidly, and yet it leads over time after Alexander's death to a number of changes in both the biblical world and in the world that would shape and affect the Christian world. Just because the Maccabees won a decisive victory, of course, did not mean that the pressures to Hellenize in any way subsided. And in many ways, some of the anxiety, at least, we see in the New Testament to Jews who are Hellenized and Jews who are not, is shaped out of this backdrop. Think of the story in Acts where you have the calling of the first deacons. Now, of course, we always focus on the deacons, but if you actually read this text, what you'll notice is that the comment that is made here is that the assumption in the first century church is that the Hellenistic Jews, it says, were not receiving their fair allotment of bread. Now, of course, there's a lot going on in the story besides this, but at least one of the components that we see here and in other parts of the New Testament is this tension between Hellenistic Jews and those who resist Hellenization. And this comes as a result of the Alexandrian Empire. And as we'll see in the next lecture, that desire for an empire, that desire for a global expansion and an imposition of one's culture on other cultures will eventually be taken up by the Romans.